So today I am not going to be talking about looks maximizing, the thing that is getting a lot of attention recently, but instead looks minimizing, which I don't know if people have heard of, and whether or not it's actually real. So for those of you who don't know, looks maxing or looks maximizing is a kind of community that it's really kind of interesting, and I should really probably make a whole video on this phenomenon in its own right. But essentially, it's a kind of community that grew out of what used to be sort of the pickup artist communities in the 00s and the 2010s. The whole idea of these pickup artist communities was essentially that we had a lot of lonely men who were not good at getting dates. But the solution was not necessarily like, hey, you need to be a better person, hey, you need to be more likable, that sort of thing. And instead it was kind of more about having the right skills or the right knowledge that you needed to do to be able to get dates. And that was really all it was about. So the idea was that you were kind of more about using particular strategies, using particular tricks, and knowing how to use them. And those were supposed to be a lot more important to you than really just, basically like your personality or your looks or anything like that. So it's a lot more about like sort of knowing these specific secret hidden strategies that the masters would teach you. Of course, a lot of people got into that sort of thing. A lot of people got turned off by it, and that turned into sort of like pickup artist hate communities, and that turned into sort of like black-pilled, actually there's nothing you can do, you're never going to be able to get dates, whatever. And that turned into looks maximizing. So the whole premise of looks maximizing is that actually those tricks don't work either, those strategies don't work either. Really all that matters is being essentially a Chad, being like the coolest, hottest guy in the world, and your personality doesn't really matter, and it's really just about having the right appearance. It's all 100% appearance. And so these looks maximizing people really, try to maximize their appearance, try to do what they think produces the best possible appearance in order to get women. Now, of course, interestingly, this doesn't necessarily always actually correlate with fitness. I think a lot of these people are not necessarily trying to be super jacked. They don't necessarily see that as a path to looks maxing. It's actually a lot more about stuff like skull structures and like the ratio of like, one bone to another bone and whether or not you have like perfect symmetry and that sort of thing. And so these people also tend to believe that you're basically just extremely based in genetics, right? Essentially, you're just screwed if you don't have the right genetics. But if you do have the right genetics, then, you have the right appearance. Or maybe you don't quite have the right genetics, but there are some things that you can do, surgeries or pills or powders or routines or whatever that can get you the rest of the way there. And that's kind of the whole concept of looks maxing. Recently, looks maxing has become really big deal because we've had a lot of sort of high profile characters in the looks maxing community break out. In particular, clavicular is the big one that everyone is talking about and all the drama that surrounds that. A lot of these people are basically big streamers on Twitch and Kick and whatever, and they're making a lot of money and a lot of attention doing that, which is why it's very interesting to talk about a guy who says that he's doing the opposite of that. He says that he's instead looks minimizing. So there's this guy that you may have seen around on Instagram if you're even vaguely, anywhere looking around the fitness industry or anything like that. And he goes by the Crooked Man 10. And his whole shtick is that he is very visibly, very obviously, has one trap that is obviously much bigger and stronger than the other. And he kind of has a slightly crooked look to him. And he claims that this is because he's been working out, he's been intentionally doing this, he's intentionally trying to create the worst physique possible. He is trying to looks minimize. And so what he's actually doing is showing a lot of videos of him basically just, working out, specifically just the one side of his body. He's okay just, exercising the one trap, he's exercising the one bicep, he's doing bench presses where he has, a lot of the weight on the right side and not on the left, that sort of thing. And so this is kind of a funny bit, right? Like it gets a lot of attention. You see a lot of people who, watch his videos, watch his content, and they go, oh, that's a terrible idea. You're going to ruin things. You're going to ruin your health, etc. And I mean, yes, possibly. But we really, like a lot of people tend to believe that having a very imbalanced physique is actually a very bad thing and it's going to lead to injury. We don't really actually tend to see that in practice. Injury is more about exposure hours, so essentially, thousands of hours worked out versus, just like particular ways you work out or using particular form or anything like that. So, we don't really have necessarily any evidence that this kind of training, just training one side of your body would necessarily screw you up forever. We also have a lot of examples over the years of people who, for some reason or another, just train like very specific parts of their physique. So, for example, arm wrestlers mostly just train their arms. They don't do a ton of work for, the rest of their body. You get things like sprinters and track cyclists who basically just train their legs and don't really train their upper body very much. And those are maybe less extreme examples. Usually you don't see somebody who's specifically training one side of their body versus the other side of their body. But you don't necessarily see, for example, people who are ostensibly hurting themselves or like really ruining their bodies by just, training specifically one area of the body. And so anyway, like you can scroll through his videos, you'll see that, he's got a lot of videos basically just doing this shtick. He starts off just saying, okay, I'm just training one trap. But again, he starts, doing all kinds of other stuff like, oh, I'm just training my glute on this side. I'm just training my arm on this side, whatever. The thing is, however, I genuinely am not sure if I think that that's real. And when I say I don't know if it's real, I mean, I think obviously he has, this one trap that is bigger than the other. He obviously has this very quote unquote crooked physique. But I don't think that that is due to training at all, actually. So if you go back and you go to his very first post that is still around, you'll see that it says that it's day 101 of working out a single trap, right? So ostensibly, you're seeing this after he's been doing this for 101 days. And the thing that you see here is that his physique in this video looks almost exactly the same as it does today. There's been basically no change since then. And so basically this kind of gives you a sense that he may or may not be actually telling the truth in terms of what this is. I genuinely don't think that this is a training related adaptation. When you look at his body, when you look at basically the way his, whole physique is set up, it's very clear that he has, not just necessarily one trap that is bigger as a result of hypertrophy from just training that one trap, but also the fact that, like his spine is crooked, like his neck is a little bent, that sort of thing. And that's not necessarily the kind of stuff that you're necessarily going to cause simply by training, one side of the body. And that's really what I think is the crux of the issue, is that I think more realistically what happened is that this guy has some kind of congenital deformation of the spine, maybe like really severe scoliosis or something else going on. And so basically this is just how his body is. He was really just born this way. And so he's really just doing this as kind of a stunt on social media. And that's fine. Like realistically, honestly, I think that's fine. Like I think that, there are a lot of people who become influencers, get a following on social media because they have basically unusual body types or because they have something different about them that is worth sharing that people will actually, watch videos for. And so there's nothing wrong with that. I think where it gets, maybe slightly less ethical or maybe slightly confusing is just the fact that obviously a lot of people actually genuinely believe that he is doing this to himself intentionally with his training, and not that this is something that he may have been, born with or, some condition that he's had. And that also then spreads sort of these misconceptions about how training works, because again, I think that a lot of people are very concerned about things like symmetry and things like balance in terms of their muscularity and in terms of their muscular development, which is obviously stuff that is important if you are training to be a bodybuilder, if you're training for, some kind of physique competition or those kinds of purposes. But, people act like it's a big deal health-wise when oftentimes I would say that it's probably not. I will say personally, I have scoliosis. This is actually a true fact about me. I have scoliosis where my spine, like right in the middle of my upper back, is a little bit crooked. Not very severe, but it causes me to have a lot of pain in that area. I have to do a lot of foam rolling. I have to do a lot of management in that area, But someone always pops out of the woodwork every now and then whenever I post a photo of my physique where I'm showing off my back, where they're like, oh, you're going to hurt yourself because you're not, training, X, Y, and Z. And it's like, yeah, I've trained all that stuff. I've done all of that over the years. That doesn't change the fact that my body was born like this. You can't fix scoliosis by simply training the muscles in a certain way. You can't undo just basically the way your spine or your body is built simply by training the muscles a little bit differently. And so that is, I think, the bad misconception there, that basically people could get the idea that this is something that is self-inflicted, and also that means that if it is self-inflicted, then it's something to avoid and also something that you could fix. And while those misconceptions are pretty common, I would say, and maybe not necessarily super harmful in a general sense, it does propagate, it does spread those myths for obviously his own personal gain, for his own benefit. I don't know if this is the case. Obviously, I'm not saying that this is a hard truth one way or the other, because I obviously don't know his exact situation. I'm just a person on the internet who's obviously looking at his videos. But, basically, if it was something where he was doing this to himself by intentionally training in a certain way, then we would expect that we would see that progressing by now. Because basically all that he's done, ostensibly, is train one side of his body. At the time that he started out making his videos, he said that that was day 101, right? And that was basically January 2025. So that was a little over a year ago, 14 months ago. If he had been continuing to quote-unquote train that way for another 365 plus days since then, we would expect that, if he got such a dramatic change just from 100 days of training, that another 400 days of training would cause bigger changes, bigger effects. And ostensibly, again, that is what he's been doing. He claims that he's been continuing to train just one side of his body in order to, quote-unquote, looks minimize. But we haven't seen basically any change in his physique whatsoever since then. You can see if you look at like his, most recent videos, he looks essentially the exact same. No change whatsoever. You can also see hilariously that he does have a photo posted where he says like day one, and it's ostensibly him looking normal before he has started doing this, looks minimizing routine. And you can tell that it looks like in this photo, he still basically looks the same on quote unquote day one, quote unquote, before he started doing this looks minimizing routine. It's harder to tell because he's younger, and because, of course, in this photo, he's not necessarily showing off that one larger trap in the same way that he does in all of his videos. But it does look like he probably pretty much looks the same, which would again imply that this is probably just a congenital condition and not necessarily something that he's done to himself via his training. And of course, he's also kind of leaned into the relatively recent popularity for the whole looks maximizing thing. He's kind of made jokes or riffs on the whole clavicular scandal, the whole ASU frat leader, androgenic, all those guys. He's kind of made riffs on those guys. And that includes a practice called bone smashing. So bone smashing is, I have to say, very silly. The idea of bone smashing, to go back to that looks maximizing, idea, is that, basically your face, it's extremely important how the bones of your face are structured, are shaped, right? Because of course, to have the right kind of face, to be attractive, you have to have the perfect ratios of your bones and whatnot. And so the idea of bone smashing is the idea that you could change your looks, your appearance over time by essentially causing trauma to the bones of your face so that they will reshape themselves. And so what that effectively means is you take a hammer and you hit yourself in the face repeatedly with the idea that this will over time slowly cause your bones to remodel and you'll develop the look that you want. That's what bone smashing is, right? Obviously, this doesn't work. This isn't a good idea, and this is a very easy way to hurt yourself, or just, even if it doesn't hurt you, it's going to just waste a lot of time in general. But hilariously, Crooked Man here says that he's, just bone smashing one side of his face, right? So he's just like, oh, I'm just bone smashing one side of my face. Funny riff, funny joke there, right? So, I don't want to go blow up this guy's spot too much. I don't really think that what he's doing is real. I think that mostly what he's doing is probably just a show for social media. And that's kind of fine. It's kind of funny. I think where it crosses over the line a little bit is where he starts to go into other stuff. So, realistically, this guy is a kid. He's like a teenager. He's just going into university. And he's only blown up in like the past year or so, obviously. And so he's kind of already sort of pivoting from, being a guy who does this kind of one-note joke about how he's just training one side of his body to talking about political opinions, sometimes sharing, frankly, very shitty opinions about other people. And so that's where it starts to get a little bit like, frustrating, annoying. Like, obviously, he's not going the way of someone like the Liver King, where the Liver King was just straight up misleading a lot of people about sort of like the kind of physique that he had and how he got there. And he was mostly using that to sell supplements and, his whole routine and his whole shtick and all of that. This guy is, yes, obviously he's certainly getting, something out of it. Like, he's become an influencer out of it. It's obviously benefiting him. But at least he's not like, he's not necessarily doing something that a lot of people will try and imitate. He, kind of frames it like, it's funny, but it's also kind of more like a cautionary tale, even if that cautionary tale is kind of, not based on a real thing that could happen. Because obviously no one is going to actually watch this content and be like, oh yeah, I want to be like this guy. I want to just train one trap so that I can have one big trap and have a really weird looking physique. No one's really doing that. So, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world that this guy has a following, but it's still very like, why does it have to be, right? Like, you feel like, okay, the joke was funny a little bit. It was funny for a little while, but don't know if it is anymore, right? So anyway, I don't know. There's not like a closing argument here. There's not a closing statement. I don't know. I unfollowed the guy because it's just like, yeah, don't really want to see your political opinions, man. The joke wasn't funny. Hasn't been funny for a while. Fine. But, I guess the real takeaway is just like, yeah, don't necessarily believe everything you see on the internet. Not all of it is real, unfortunately, especially in this day and age. Anyway, as always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash the notification bell, comment down below, send your hate mail down there. If you're fans of the Crooked Man coming to brigade me, whatever that is, have a good week. I'll talk to you all next time.